Well, we want to welcome you in to this midweek Bible study. And Bill and I have been studying and talking about Psalm 62. And before we get into the actual psalm itself, I want to be the first one to wish Bill and Jennifer Watt. Now, we're recording on Monday, so this is old news by Wednesday. But today, as we are recording, is Bill and Jennifer's 29th wedding anniversary. So congratulations.
Thank you. And I think you would agree with me, and that we both would. I think Herb Winchester said it best years ago, that we both, as far as our wives are concerned, have outkicked our coverage.
Amen to that, brother. I know I have.
Yeah.
Well, we're looking at a psalm that we felt like last week would be a little more upbeat. And it's upbeat because the psalmist here, while he is on the run, probably from his son Absalom, his attitude and how he handles the circumstance there really does make this a psalm that reads a little bit differently than the ones that we've looked at, the last couple that we've looked at. Even though he does seem to be in a time of trouble, he doesn't ask God for anything. It is a psalm that is full of faith and trust. There's very little in this psalm concerning David's fear or any despair or even any petition. He's not really asking God of anything, but he's just making one statement after another concerning how he sees God. And so attitude is a big part of life. Bill, you and I have been talking about this, and how we look at the day, how we look at the week, how we look at the month, how we see ourselves in this season. It means everything.
Yeah, it's all about perspective and not being, being bound by your circumstances. And David, speaks. Like you said, he's probably, many people speculate that he's running from his son, and so he's in a pretty tough spot. But again, he will depend on God. And it's also, this kind of speaks to what it really means to be content in life, where contentment comes from. And I was looking around to get some sort of different perspective, and I came across, we're all big fans of Dr. Seuss. And Dr. Seuss does have a book that actually speaks to this a little bit. Did I ever tell you how lucky you are? And so I'm going to read just a couple of quotes from it.
So we want to be sure that all the teachers are tuning in right now.
Oh, yeah, they need to be. He says, when you think things are bad, when you start to get mad, you should do what I do. Just tell yourself, ducky, you're really quite lucky. Some people are much more, much more unlucky than you. As only Dr. Seuss can say it. And he also says you ought to be thankful a whole heaping lot for the places and people you're lucky you're not.
Mm-hmm.
So, where does our contentment come from? Does it come from our, are we solely dependent on our circumstances? And, David would say, no, we shouldn't be, that we should be dependent on God, that's where our true contentment comes from.
And in this psalm here, David is putting his complete trust in God. I know that as hard as some have it, and, as we do this Bible class, we have some of our members that are really going through a lot of difficulty. If you have family, parents, or grandparents that are still living, as life goes on and on, the more difficult it becomes for them. And so we're not making light of difficulty.
No.
But what we are saying is, as hard as Dr. Seuss is saying here is, however as hard as you have it, you can always look down the road and find someone that that has a more difficult life.
Well, actually, in one of my speech classes this semester, I had a young lady who had been through countless surgeries for a tumor, and she, but to meet her for you wouldn't know anything. I mean, that she was just always upbeat, always cheerful. And really, you meet someone like that and it's just amazing. But, again, she was someone who totally depended on God. And I mean, it's easy for me to sit here and say that, yes, we need to do that, but it's another thing to actually do it. And
Yeah,
so,
and this is going to be the challenge for this in reading through this psalm here. It's one thing to read the Word of God, another thing to allow it to drill down into the heart where it just becomes kind of how I see life. This is how David sees God. This is how David sees his circumstances. May not be how I see it, and how we get the Word of God ingested in such a way where it becomes our way of looking at it, our way of looking at God, our way of looking at our circumstances is the real challenge and the goal before us.
and like what you're saying there too, is that, as we'll see in this psalm as well, that in many respects, David's talking to himself.
He does some of that. He sure does. Let's talk about the psalm let's read through it one good time here. Bill, you want to do the honors? This is the NIV here.
Truly, my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Yes, my soul find rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He's my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Surely the lowborn are but a breath. The highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they're nothing. Together they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, O God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love. And you reward everyone according to what they have done.
So David calls God just an overview of the psalm as we read through it a couple of times, and but in verses 1, 2, and 7, he says about God, you are my salvation. He calls God his salvation in verse 1 and verse 2 and also in verse 7. I don't think he's talking here about like eternal salvation, like you and I tend to think of salvation, so much as it is salvation from his circumstances, the circumstances that he finds himself in. He also refers to God in verse 2, verse 6, and verse 7 as his rock. And he makes a statement at least two times, I think 2 times in this psalm here. He says, I see this in verse 2 here, I'll never be shaken. Says it again a little bit later on in the psalm that he will not be shaken because God is his rock. He also mentions God in verse 5 as his hope. My hope, he says, my hope. In verse 7 and 8, he refers to him as his refuge. And then as you read at the end of the psalm here in verse 11, he says in verse 11 that with God is all power belongs to God. And then he wraps up talking about God's unfailing love. And so these are just some observations as we read through the psalm a couple of times together that kind of jumped out at us, is that David has this unique ability to articulate, to speak out his assurances, the assurances that he has about who God is, and he announces these assurances. They kind of jump off the page here, and it's what David does whenever he is in these difficult circumstances. He just says some things about God that he believes to be true.
Yeah. Also, my fortress. my fortress as well as my rock and my salvation. But
Yes.
it seems like also, we talked about this a little earlier, that verses 3 and 4, he starts to address his whoever it is, that whether it's his son or whatever, how long are you going to assault me? What, will you throw me down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? The voice changes to, he's addressing whoever it is that's pursuing him or trying to, to pull him down.
Yeah, he does. He does address them, doesn't he? I mean, he just comes right out and he, he rebukes them for their persistence in attacking him, and kind of lays a warning that what's coming to them. But David describes his enemies as those who are. It's like they can't get up for a whole lot, but they can get up. They can get up to bring him down. They won't organize for a lot of things, but they'll organize in such a way to be able to topple him and to bring him down. He describes them as liars, as being two-faced when he says they're their mouths.
Right.
With their mouths they bless, but with their hearts they curse, is kind of how he describes his enemy there. But you're right. That's exactly what he does.
And it's like and we're all guilty of blessing with our mouths, and yet in our hearts our hearts always betray us. And here he's talking about people that they're smooth talkers, but you can't trust them. So and it's kind of also when he talks about this leaning wall, this tottering fence, some have speculated that he's talking about himself, or could be that he's talking about these people that, they don't have their faith in God. They don't have their God as rock and salvation. So they are also leaning walls and tottering fences. There's a couple of ways you probably could interpret that.
Yeah, as you and I were reading and studying that, we read, various scholars that kind of argue about who is the leaning wall, the tottering fence here. Is it David himself, or is it his enemy? It's not very clear here. The way the NIV reads, it's almost as if, that would all of you throw me down, leaning wall, this tottering fence. I don't know. I mean, it's you can make a good argument either way, I guess.
And what also occurs to me, George, is that he's talking about, surely they intend to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. It's also true of us, even today, especially today, maybe with social media, that we tend to build people up and then just tear them down. And that happens a lot. We tend to, I don't know why that says something about our nature. We like to build people up and then just to build them up to tear them down. And I kind of hear a little bit of that in here as well.
Yeah, and I guess a lot of people jump on the bandwagon whenever someone makes a statement that's negative toward an individual, and then all the comments that follow is just it's ridiculous, the things that people say. But that's human nature, I suppose. What's I guess even a little bit I guess sad is whenever deep inside, within, whenever you hear bad news or misfortune falling upon someone and feeling good within, like, I'm glad that happened to that person. That really kind of says a lot about you, kind of where your heart is. And we're all kind of wired that way, especially if you don't like the person for whatever reason.
Right.
But that's a good point. I love the next section right here, that verses 5, 6, and 7. The thing that we pointed out in those 3 verses there is, let's just read it. Yes, my soul finds rest in God, my hope comes from him. Truly, he is my rock and salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. In my notes, I underline the word my. I mean, how many times David uses the word my here? Of course,
Mhm.
he references his soul, my soul, but he says, my hope, my rock, my salvation, my fortress, my salvation again, my honor or glory in some translations,
Mhm.
my mighty rock, he says, and my refuge. And so 9 times he is personalizing. And this is David saying, this he is mine. He is
Right.
speaking of from a personal perspective. This is my experience with who
This is
God.
my experience. And then he turns in the next verse there and says, you need to trust in him as well.
Mhm.
Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. So, we are to, and that's what we all should be as Christians, demonstrating God's love to other people and showing God that our trust in God, that through our trust in God and how we live and through example, that will lead others to do the same.
Exactly, but not leaving verses 5, 6, and 7. It almost sounds like to me, as you and I read it, kind of like a pep talk. Where
Oh yeah,
David is again saying these assurances about who God is, um, and the importance of building our faith up by. I mean, um, how many of us could use some of this in our prayer life? Where we just describe God in these ways. God, you are my fortress. God, you are my rock. You are my hope. You are my salvation. But this is kind of what David is doing here, kind of challenging all of us to get beyond having a Bible study to actually experiencing God, maybe the next level where God becomes very personal. It's a spiritual pep talk as I see it. I love Psalm 46, how it begins. He in verse 7 here, he says, my refuge. And the note that I made there is the Psalm 46, one of my favorite Psalms, says, God is our refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam and the mountains quake with their surging. That's the image that refuge conjures up in my mind. Is how that psalm begins. Is that God is very powerful, and we can find our rest in Him no matter what's going on all around us. That He
right.
is my
Right.
rock and refuge.
And how often we, like David, like exhort ourselves and give ourselves a pep talk. It's a perfect way to describe this. This is a spiritual pep talk that he's giving himself.
And so he says in verse 7, verse 7 here is, I guess it's verse 8 that you referenced, that now David is talking to me and you, and he's talking to all of us that are tuning in. Trust him at all times, you people. David is doing it, and now he says, hey, what's good enough for me is good for you.
Mm-hmm.
So he says, hey, trust him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him. Pour out your hearts to him like you and I would pour out water, not so much like honey, some of it might stay in there, but like let it all out. Like, pour out your hearts to God. God is, again, there's that word again, he is our refuge.
Yeah, and it's pour out your hearts to him, as you say. It's just it's praising God, it's confessing, it's just and that's David. You're going to hear everything, right? And you just pour out your heart to God is how we should all be, and how we should all approach prayer.
I love that verse there, verse 8. All right, everybody, we're studying Psalm 62. We worked our way to verse 9 and 10. They maybe go together here, 9 and 10. You want to read that again for us, Bill? Let's kind of.
Yeah, surely the lowborn are but a breath, the highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they're nothing together, they're only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. The love of money is the root of all evil. The love of money is the root of all evil. Not necessarily is it bad. Plenty of people that have money that are good people and are good godly people.
Hey, listen, a lot of good things that are done in the world are done by people with resources.
Hmm.
And I don't necessarily, usually when you talk about something like the love of money, which is the definition of greed, which the New Testament talks a lot about. I mean, you read the list in the New Testament to watch out for, in every list, greed appears. So it's something that we've got to watch out for.
And greed doesn't always involve just money. You can be greedy about a lot of things.
A lot of things. You can be greedy with your time. You can be greedy with the fact that you have talent.
Right.
And yeah, you don't necessarily have to be a rich person to be a greedy person. It's really a spirit. Um, it's how it's kind of. But he's saying here in this section, he's saying here in this section here is not to trust. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter if a person doesn't have anything or they have a lot. They fall in the same category.
Mhm.
They fall in the same category of not being able to deliver. When it's all said and done, he says, if weighed on a balance, they're nothing together. They're only a breath.
And we all face the same fate. I mean, we're nothing. We're but a vapor, as he describes in Ecclesiastes. I mean, it's so we're all going to meet the same fate.
Yep. And so, what is the profit of man if he gains the whole world yet forfeits his own soul?
That's right.
That's what Jesus said. And so, David's identity was tied not to people who had a little or a lot, but rather in his relationship to God. David trusted God. So the question is it possible to hold great wealth without trusting in those riches?
It's difficult. I would think it's difficult. Now, again, I have nothing to, as far as that's concerned, I don't really have that problem because I don't have any riches. But I would think the difficulty is that, of course, like we said, you can make anything a God.
Yeah.
And I would think that with riches, it makes it very difficult. But, it's not impossible, but I would think that it'd be very difficult to do.
The passage you were talking about, Paul said in 1 Timothy 6, 9, and 10, those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a trap and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Those are Paul's words there. Jesus said in Luke 12 and verse 15, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. So again, the question here is how much of what you have has you? How much of what you possess possesses you? That greed is a spirit issue more than it is a hard, fast amount of money. And when you think of who we are, what kind of blessings we have as American citizens, we're vastly blessed compared to all the countries in the world.
And a lot of times, you become a slave to that. You become enslaved by whatever, or it's maybe the desire for wealth and the constant pursuit of that, and it's never enough.
So the last couple of verses here, Bill, I'll go ahead and read them, and then we can just kind of wrap up with some closing thoughts. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, is unfailing love. And you reward everyone according to what they have done. And that's 11 and 12, the last couple of verses there.
It's interesting, he brings up God's power and God's love.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact is that there's nothing more powerful than God's love. Nothing. And that's unfailing love. And he also says they're interesting that, that everybody gets you get what you deserve. Meaning what?
Well, I mean, I love to think about, heaven and what it's going to be like. And for a good part of my life, a lot of the thoughts of heaven were the judgment. It's like are you going to make it?
Right.
Are you going to be able to make it? And I guess it's probably in the last few years that I have thought about what the scriptures talk about. And what he's talking about here is he says, you reward everyone according to what they have done. That the things that we do in our bodies, the things that we do in our bodies, that based on what we've done with our bodies, with our resources, with our talents, with our treasure, time, talent, and treasures, that will be rewarded. And that is something that you read about in the New Testament as well. I have no idea what these rewards are going to look like, but that is something that he brings out here, is that you reward everyone according to what they have done. And
so, as we age, of course, now you're not nearly as elderly as myself.
As wise.
As wise? Right. The older you get, the more you start thinking about, your legacy. What have I done? What have I done? And this occurs to me as I hear that God's rewarding you, and what you've done with your time, what you've done with your talents, what you've done with your wealth, whatever. But yeah, it's more about, and again, it's also about the heart, ultimately, about the heart, and what truly what's behind those deeds. Why it's one thing for me to, I've said this before, but it's one thing for me to contribute to the church because it's a write-off on my taxes, as opposed to the fact that I'm doing it because I genuinely want to do something for the Lord and for God's church.
Yeah, and you want to help the poor.
Right.
Do something for someone else. All right, so we lost our text. I'm not sure. We were having all kinds of problems tonight with our feed here. But I'll read through it one more time. Bill, would you lead us in a word of prayer when we get done?
Sure.
So David says, truly my soul finds rest in God. My salvation comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. How long will you assault me? Would all of you throw me down this leaning wall, this tottering fence? Surely they have intended to topple me from my lofty place. They take delight in lies. With their mouths they bless, but in their hearts they curse. Yes, my soul finds rest in God. My hope comes from him. Truly he is my rock and my salvation. He is my fortress. I will not be shaken. My salvation and my honor depend on God. He is my mighty rock, my refuge. Trust in him at all times, you people. Pour out your hearts to him, for God is our refuge. Surely the lowborn are but a breath. The highborn are but a lie. If weighed on a balance, they are nothing. Together, they are only a breath. Do not trust in extortion or put vain hope in stolen goods. Though your riches increase, do not set your heart on them. One thing God has spoken, two things I have heard. Power belongs to you, God, and with you, Lord, love is unfailing love. And you reward everyone according to what they have done. May the Lord bless the reading and the hearing and the studying of his word tonight.
Well, let's go to the Lord in a word of prayer. Close with a word of prayer. Father, we come to you at this time, and we thank you for the words of David. Thank you for reminding us that indeed you're our rock, our salvation, our fortress. And I want you to be mindful of that, and that we should not be dependent on our circumstances. Although that is easy to say, but because we know that there are many out there that are dealing with difficult circumstances, whether it be their bodies, whether it be their financial circumstances, or whatever the case may be, and especially during this time where it is a wonderful reminder from David that we shouldn't be dependent upon our circumstances, and that we need to be once again reminded that as far as what's the most powerful thing in the universe, you're always pursuing us, and that you love us, and that and it's through your love that, of course, that you offered your son. And we remember these things. Help us to keep these in mind. We can ask that God.
Amen. Amen.